G'day brothers and sisters. Well, today in Luke chapter 14, we encounter Jesus in the house of a Pharisee. This is remarkable. Despite all of the grief that they gave Jesus, despite their opposition, he was willing to have fellowship with them. And this is a beautiful picture of the gospel message. Jesus will have fellowship with anybody who invites him in. And let's look at what the text says. It says, one Sabbath when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. The sense of the Greek here is the idea that they're watching him almost like a hawk, and they're watching him carefully. They're studying his every behavior. They're listening to his words attentively. It's almost like they're trying to trap him. And it says, there in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling in his body. Now, the sense of the Greek here is this idea that he has a condition called dropsy or edema. It's a condition which affects parts of the body when you have excessive fluid or excessive swelling in blood tissues. And it was documented in ancient medical reports. And this man is brought in front of Jesus. Now, what's remarkable about this is, given the fact that this was at the house of a prominent Pharisee, they would not have invited this man in. He wouldn't have been part of the dinner guests. They tended to only invite the elite and the top students and the top teachers. So the fact that this man is brought in front of Jesus tends to indicate that he's kind of there in order to trap Jesus. The Pharisees have brought him in kind of like a plant because they want to trap him or they want to test him. So it says that Jesus says to the Pharisees and the experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. What's remarkable about this is the Pharisees debated what was acceptable, what was lawful to do on the Sabbath. Remember, in the Old Testament, Moses gave the law. God gave the laws to Moses, and one of the laws was that you had to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So the religious teachers made a whole list of things that you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath in order to be obedient to the commandment. They went well in excess of what the Old Testament actually originally meant. They put in place all of these additional laws beyond the heart of what the Sabbath was all about in the Old Testament. Now, under the Pharisaic law, you could provide medical treatment to somebody on the Sabbath. It just had to be a life-threatening, a life or death situation. If it was a chronic condition or if it was something that the person was living with, you had to wait till the next day. And this is where Jesus sort of confronts them on their hypocrisy. So remember, under the Pharisaic law, you could provide medical treatment to somebody, but only if it was life or death, only if it was an acute situation that was an emergency. If it was a chronic issue, you had to just wait until the next day. And that's what Jesus says. He says he takes hold of the man and he heals him and he sends him on his way. Now, the Pharisees knew that Jesus had performed healings on the Sabbath. The Bible had recorded a number of occasions where Jesus had done miracles on the Sabbath, and he had declared that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. And by declaring that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, he was saying, I am the God who gave the Sabbath law to begin with. So the Pharisees would have been upset with the fact that Jesus performed this healing, as they had been upset with the other healings that he performed. But listen to how Jesus traps them in their hypocrisy. He says, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? Or will you not immediately pull your child out? Now, this exposes the religious teachers' hypocrisy, because in theory, the type of well or cistern that Jesus was talking about here wasn't a deep well or a deep cistern, which meant in theory, technically speaking, if a child or an ox was in need of help, say they had fallen into this well, technically speaking, you could actually leave them there overnight. It's not a life or death situation. You can just chuck them some food to eat and give them some water, and they'll be fine overnight if a child was to fall into the cistern. So technically speaking, it's not a life or death situation. You can wait until the next day in order to pull the child out or in order to help the oxen. But notice Jesus exposes their hypocrisy. In the same way that you wouldn't make the ox wait or you wouldn't make a child wait, you'd get them out straight away, and yet that wouldn't be considered breaching the Sabbath law. Here, they're attacking Jesus for healing people straight away. Yes, in theory, Jesus could have waited to the day after the Sabbath to provide healing. It wasn't technically a life or death situation. But he is saying that the Sabbath is a way for God to be honored. And what better way for God to be honored than a man who needed healing to get healing on this day? So this is a powerful story. But it goes on to say that Jesus will then give a series of teachings, a series of lectures, if you will, in order to further illustrate his teaching and what his mission is all about. Now, this might sound strange to us, but in Jesus' day, this was the expectation. You had what was called symposiums. Whenever a special guest or a religious teacher or a philosopher came to a dinner table, they would literally give a lecture or they would give some teaching to the audience. And this is what Jesus does. He goes on to say to them, when he noticed how the guests were picking places of honor at the table, he told them this in parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may be invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then humiliated, you will take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. Again, it's important to remember in Jesus' day that often invitations to dinner or to banquets often went over an extended period of time. And if you were throwing a wedding feast, the wedding feast went over a series of days. And honor was so important in people in Jesus' day. Honor was basically your public reputation. It was how others perceived you. If you did good things, if you were a moral person, and if you did great deeds, and if you gained a lot of glory for yourself and your country, you would be a person of high honor. If you did notorious things or you did bad things, or you're a person who was sick, a person who was blind or deaf, or somebody who was lowly, you were considered to have low honor. So it was very important for people of high honor when they went to a dinner or to a wedding feast. It was very important for them to take the seats of honor at a banquet, to sit closest to the host. So if you imagine a big banquet table, you would try to sit as close to the king or as close to the distinguished host as possible, or the governor or the ruler. The closer you sat to them, the more honor you had publicly. And if this was a wedding feast which went for a few days, different guests would be coming in and out. So you can imagine, if you're a person of great distinguish, you might come on the first day of the wedding feast and take a seat really, really close to the bridal party. And then all of a sudden, after a few days, somebody who's more important than you comes, and what happens? Your place gets bumped. And this, of course, would have been embarrassing. So Jesus says, when you come, or when you go to a banquet or a wedding feast, be a humble person. Be a person with humility. Don't esteem yourself, esteem others. And this would have been really confrontational to that audience, because honor was so important to them. If your honor was stripped in public, it was said to be the worst possible thing which could happen to you and your family. Yet by opposite, if you did something which achieved great honor, that was the best thing for you and for your family. Now, Jesus kind of alludes here to Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25 says, do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, come up here, than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. So the point Jesus is getting at is that a person who lives by kingdom ethics doesn't look for their own glory, doesn't elevate themselves, but they look to God to esteem them and to elevate them. And they look first and foremost for God's glory. Then Jesus will say, he gives another little teaching snippet. He says, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters or relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now here, Jesus is not saying literally you can never invite anybody who's important, or you can never invite your friends or family. The sense of the Greek, and I don't want to go too much into the technicality of it because it's a special type of Greek verb. It's an imperative Greek verb in the present tense, but it's basically saying do not keep inviting these people. Look to invite others and to include others. And the types of people that he lists here, the people like the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, they were rejected. They were shunned by society. People typically didn't include them. And the point of what Jesus is saying here is that we are to model God's character. Just like God includes the blind, just like God includes the poor, just like Jesus fellowshiped with those who were meek, he's calling us to do the same. The kingdom is not an elite club. It's not just there for those who have prestige or those who just have honor, those who are rich. No, it's for even the brokenhearted. It's for the poor. It's for the lame. It's for the blind. And that's what Jesus is challenging these religious teachers. He's saying to them, at all your dinner guests, you only ever invite people who have prestige and honor. No, you are God's teachers to the world. You should be including others, those who lack. You should be including them in your gatherings, because this is a picture of the kingdom of God. And that's what Jesus was saying. He says, I want you to include those who are meek. I want you to include those who are broken, because this is a picture of what God's character is about and what the kingdom of God looks like. And that's why he restored that man earlier who had the dropsy. It was a way of showing that this is the type of person that God welcomes into his kingdom. Remember, what was the message that Jesus gave when he said, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me? What? It was to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim recovery of sight to the blind, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the good news is preached to the poor. This is the character and the shape that Jesus' ministry takes, and we should do the same thing. It isn't that we ignore the elite. Jesus was there at the house of somebody who was elite, but it was saying that my ministry, God's kingdom, is a place where the broken can come in. And then somebody at the table says to him, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Now, you would know by now that the average Jewish person had this idea that one day when the Messiah came, there was going to be this great messianic banquet, and the Messiah was going to rule, and the nations were going to flock to him, and he was going to remove all of Israel's oppressors. And in this story, because the Messiah was going to be a great king, they believed that blessed would be the person who was invited to dine with the king. And they also knew that this was a picture of what was going to happen one day in the kingdom of God, that we would be able to dwell in the kingdom of God, and there was going to be this lavish and great banquet as we celebrated God and we dined and had fellowship with God. And this man says, blessed is the one who's going to take their place. And once again, the religious teachers would debate and argue, who is the one who is going to get a place at this great messianic banquet one day? And again, Jesus gives this great parable. He says, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. Now again, because in this day and age, there was no social media, there were no text messages, you couldn't just email somebody or send them a message on WhatsApp or an invite on Facebook or whatever it is. Typically, a great ruler, when he had a big banquet, he would send out his servants to go and tell people that that there was gonna be a great banquet. And they would send back kind of like an RSVP. And then in this story, he sends out his servant and he invites everybody. And then it says, at the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. So in other words, he sent the invitations out through his servant. And then when everything was finally ready for the banquet, he then goes out and he sends his servant once more to tell those people who had RSVP'd that the banquet was ready. Now again, we can assume that this is like a wedding banquet or a great celebration, and these things take time. It's not like today where you have a wedding event and you just send out the invitations and everybody knows the date ahead of time. You didn't know all of that information ahead of time. You knew that something was coming up because you had received the original invite, but you didn't know the precise timing. So it says that the time is now ready, the banquet is ready. So those who had been invited would know to put down everything and to come to the banquet. But notice they don't do that. A couple of them give excuses. It says that one says, I have bought a field, you need to excuse me. Another says, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. They all give excuses. You know, in Jesus' day, if you bought a piece of land like it was today, typically the contract stipulated that you had to go and see the land before you actually purchased it. Again, the other person is buying 5 yoke of oxen. Oxen tended to the field and you use them to tread on grain and things like that. And the sheer number of oxen that he's buying tends to indicate that this person was a rich person. But whatever the excuse is, the fact is that having accepted the original invitation, they have now rejected it. And this would have caused a great dishonor to the original host. Having invited them, they have chosen not to receive and not to attend. And for Jesus, this is a picture of all of those who reject the kingdom of God. Everybody is invited to be part of the kingdom of God. But how foolish are those who reject that invitation? So what does it say? The master sends out the servant in this story and he says, go now, go into the streets, go everywhere and tell people to come in. Go everywhere and tell people. Again, this is a picture of the gospel message. God sends us out all over the place, to the streets, to the highways, out to the countries, which in the parable is a picture of the Gentile nations. He sends us out everywhere to go and bring people. But notice, there is no limitation to the amount of places there are at this great banquet. It's available to anybody who wants to come in. And what Jesus is saying to these religious teachers is, I'm putting the invitation out there to everybody, but the elite, those like you who know the law, are not coming in. And those who are poor, those who are blind, those who are lame are coming in. The Gentiles are coming in to the kingdom of God. But God's own people are rejecting it. And then what happens? The master is angry in this story. He gets upset and he has wrath over those who did not accept the invitation. This is a picture of God's wrath. The Bible talks about how God has a holy wrath, and his wrath is poured out against those who reject the invitation for salvation. Again, brothers and sisters, this is one of those deep parables which we could cut into because there's many layers to it, but we'll leave it there. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you next time.